Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. This episode of Future Squared is brought to you by Spigot, the largest provider of innovation management software to some of the world's foremost companies, including the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Westpac, CSIRO, Westfield, AT&T, Citi, Coca-Cola, MetLife Insurance, Pfizer, Sprint, Unilever, and many more. Spigot has powered innovation and process improvement for large enterprises, enabling them to engage with their employees, customers, and partners to build a culture of innovation. Spigot is recognized by both Gartner and Forrester as the leader in the innovation management sector. For a limited time, listeners of Future Squared can get 10% of Spigot's innovation management platform. Taking advantage of this offer is super easy. Simply sign up for a demo at futuresquared.xyz/spigot. That's SPIGIT. And now for today's episode. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I bring you Tyler Cowen. He's an American economist, academic, and writer. He's chair of economics and a professor at George Mason University, and he's co-author of the popular economics blog Marginal Revolution. He's also ventured into online education by starting Marginal Revolution University. He currently writes a regular column for Bloomberg View and has written for such publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Time, Wired, Newsweek, and the Wilson. In February of 2011, Cowen received a nomination as one of the most influential economists in the last decade in a survey by The Economist. He was ranked number 72 among the top 100 global thinkers in 2011 by Foreign Policy magazine for finding markets in everything. Tyler has published a number of books, including An Economist Gets Lunch, New Rules for Everyday Foodies, Discover Your Inner Economist, The Great Stagnation, The Best-Selling Average is Over, and the newly released The Complacent Class, the self-defeating quest for the American dream. It's received critical praise from best-selling thought leaders such as Malcolm Gladwell, who says that Tyler Cowen's blog, Marginal Revolution, is the first thing he reads every morning. He's gone on to say that the book has been on his nightstand after he devoured it in just one sitting, and he's in round-the-clock Cowen saturation right now. So with praise like that, I just can't wait to get stuck into this interview with the one and only Tyler Cowen. Welcome to the show, Tyler.
Thank you for having me on.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and I understand you're joining us all the way from Virginia.
That is correct. US of A.
US of A. We're having a little chat before we went live about the pros and cons of living, say, in the suburbs versus the city, and just having access to that, the wide open spaces, and avoiding the fear of missing out that comes with living in the city and just being constantly surrounded by noise and people.
I like how the suburbs make me restless, and then I want to explore other things. The city wears me down a bit.
Yep, I totally agree with that. So, Tyler, your new book has just come out as of February the 27th, and it's called The Complacent Class, and it explores how technology is effectively making us somewhat lazier. And it's received critical reviews from the likes of Malcolm Gladwell, who basically has also said that your blog, Marginal Revolution, is the first thing he reads every morning. And he's called your new book brilliant, and it's been on his nightstand every day after devouring it in one sitting. So that's quite high praise from a well-respected author such as Malcolm Gladwell. So firstly, congratulations on the release of the book. And have you been quite busy since its release on embarking on any sort of a book tour, or have you keeping it quite low-key?
I would call it a podcast tour, not low key at all.
Uh-huh.
But most of it I've done from this sofa here.
Fantastic. And
And this
that's
is the basic result of information technology making it easier for us not to move around. It's reflected in the very book tour itself.
exactly. And while you're embarking on what I like to call a virtual book tour, the amount of people that you can actually get in front of is significantly bigger than what it would be if you were just, giving keynotes to several hundred people at a time. I mean, this podcast itself goes out to now just over 100,000 people a month, and I'm sure there's others that you have appeared on where they're reaching even larger audiences. So it just speaks to the wonders of modern technology.
Yes, that's right. I think what we're doing is by sending information around more efficiently, we're making it possible to slow down change in the physical world. So many of the contemporary innovations, they keep us at home. So Amazon will send you packages.
Mm-hmm.
Uber now sends you food, your evening's dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Netflix gives you your entertainment at home. And I think the net result is somewhat of a stultification of our own cultural existences.
And that's essentially what the book explores, the impact of connectivity on humanity. And you argue in some ways that it's making us complacent and that the United States in particular is standing still. So does this apply to the United States as a whole? Or, I mean, when I explore this topic of the complacent class, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, I suppose, triggered from the recent political results. And, when I spoke with the likes of Alec Ross, who was the technology advisor to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, he mentioned that, in places like the Rust Belt, there is a tendency to want to bring back the past rather than learn new skills to take advantage of the future. But it sounds like what you're talking about applies across the board.
Yes, and also to a lot of Western Europe and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But I view the election of Trump as a search for a kind of stasis. It's a very backward-looking vision. When Trump talks about infrastructure, it's not about the smart grid and biotech. It's about repairing our tunnels and roads and bridges. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but it's not very inspiring. It's all about making America great again, not building a new and better and brighter America for the future. So I think this is a kind of malaise. It's overtaken much of the country. The Hillary Clinton campaign, she also said, things are okay. She never quite said they were great, but I'm going to keep them the way they are. And that was not enough to beat Trump, who was promising to go back to the past. And I think there's something wrong with my country, which is supposed to be the most dynamic in the world, but it's become obsessed with slowing down change.
Yeah, and it seems as if this is actually heightening segregation between wealthy and poor, the haves and have-nots. So effectively becoming kind of like a snowballing result. So how does that play out when we have technologies sort of making the divide bigger?
Well, since the 1990s, there's been more segregation by income in the United States. So rich people are more likely to live next door to other rich people, and in turn, poor people live next to other poor people. We know from the research of Raj Chetty, this tends to limit upward social mobility, that it's mixed neighborhoods that help poorer people rise to the top. So this makes income inequality worse. It also gives us, greater crime problems with opioids, and we're walling ourselves off in these bubbles. You have, Clinton supporters who basically don't know any Trump voters. People who are Trump voters who consider Clinton supporters, the enemy in some way. And it's an unhealthy state of affairs for this nation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And on us living in bubbles, I believe it was David and Goliath, a book by Malcolm Gladwell, where there's a similar thing that he talks about there, which was hockey players. And when they first enlist in, say, pee-wee hockey at the age of 5 or 6 years old, it's the kids who are born, say, in the first few months of the year, January through to, say, May, who tend to make the team because they're a bit older, they're a bit bigger, and what happens is they get more opportunity because they play in the first team, they get better coaching, and then if you follow them through to the NHL, there is a massive sort of disproportionate number of players who are born in the first half of the year. And similarly, if wealthy people are just are segregated and only hanging around with other wealthy people and poor people with other poor people, then that gap is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes, and schools are often the most segregated part of American society, and that doesn't bode well for the future.
Definitely not. And you raised the point around bubbles, which is a very valid point in today's age of algorithms. And when we got started chatting, we were talking about the likes of Uber and delivering us our food. I know in your book you talk about some examples like Match.com, matches us with potential mates. Spotify matches us with music we might like. And we're quite, I suppose, comfortable or used to seeing this comments from these providers appear on our data feeds, which says something like, because you listened to X, you might like Y, which keeps us in those bubbles. I'd love to see something that told us, because you listened to X, how about trying something different like Y?
Yes. People sometimes ask me, well, what's wrong with all of this? I mean, isn't it comfortable? And of course it is, or we wouldn't do it. But you see overall, at least in the United States, rates of economic growth are down, labor markets are slower to adjust, our rates of productivity growth are down. Our economy is actually falling somewhat behind, say, Australia or Canada. So this, to me, is a very worrying set of developments. One cannot actually be complacent forever.
Definitely. And on the slowdown with the labor markets, I mean, we've obviously seen a massive increase in technology. Moore's law just keeps moving forward. And if we draw some parallels to, say, the early 20th century, when there was that transition from steam to electrification, there was, say, a productivity paradox of about 30 to 40 years where productivity declined before companies really adopted and started utilizing electricity at its fullest capacity. Do you see us potentially being in a productivity paradox, or is this something much bigger than that?
No, I think we're definitely in a productivity paradox. Progress is not over. That's extremely unlikely. But to turn the internet into something truly beneficial will still take decades. So a lot of the internet now, it makes our leisure time better, but you don't see productivity in the office going up much. And in fact, it sometimes distracts people and lowers productivity in the office. So you mentioned with electricity, with automobiles, it takes decades to build the surrounding institutions so that you can actually take advantage of these developments. And I feel we're at the same place with the internet. It's kind of an add-on to existing structures, and we need to restructure so we're building around the internet with the internet at the center.
Yeah.
Like higher education would be an example. You can email your professor, which is nice, but the internet should be the center of the university, and the professors, in a sense, the add-on.
So that's effectively arguing for, I suppose, redeveloping the education system. And I guess we're seeing entrepreneurs try to take that into their own hands with a lot of these online learning platforms, but at its core, the education system is still very much about K-12 education, university, get your degree, and so on. And those institutions seem to be a lot slower to adapt and respond to the technology change.
That's right. It's not that I think we can do all or even most education online, but just transmitting information is best done online. So the professor or the teacher should become more like a coach, a role model, a source of inspiration, and a guide, rather than someone who stands at a blackboard with a piece of chalk. That's what's inefficient.
Yeah, well,
it's not that we should take the human being out of the equation. It's that we need to make the human actually more important.
Well, that's exactly right. The human being should be there to facilitate outcomes. In terms of the transfer of knowledge and information, there's no reason why you can't deliver that online and then use that information in a class context to actually apply it and work towards some sort of a facilitated outcome where the teacher becomes a lot more valuable.
Yes, that's right.
So on, I suppose, technology making us lazier, I mean, isn't this just something that human beings have more or less done from the dawn of time? I mean, we were once hunter-gatherers. We had to hunt our own food, kill it, clean it, cook it, all that type of stuff. Well, obviously, today we just walk down to the local grocery store, pick up all manner of produce from all over the world, and we've become focused on individual skill sets. So, I mean, is this just another iteration of that evolution, or is it really making us lazier?
This is quite different, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The technologies of the 19th and 20th century, in virtually every case, they made it easier to get around more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So first you have the railroad and the car and the plane. Those get bigger and better and faster. But if you look at travel over the last 40 years, for the most part, it's gotten slower. China would be an exception, but in the United States, train travel has not gotten any faster in many decades. The bus network is being dismantled. Most people's commutes, there's higher levels of congestion. We're often going back, say to bicycling. Mm-hmm. And we're giving up the idea that we're mastering our own physical space and, withdrawing inwards to ourselves.
Yeah, and on going back to bicycling, I know you talk about millennials driving a lot less than they once did. Is this just a reflection of them, say, moving to more urban spaces, bicycling more, and being a little bit more environmentally conscious and using mobility services such as Uber and Lyft?
That's some of it, but even in the suburbs, it's pronounced that driving has become less important. It's more likely you'll be driven somewhere, and when you grow up as a kid, you're not going around on your bicycle exploring your neighborhood. Rather, your parents tend to schedule you, they control your movements, they're more likely to medicate you, they may forbid you from playing outside. It's a very different environment, and it gets back to this excess concern with safety that I call a form of complacency.
Yeah, and what you said there about parents preventing their kids from going outside, I'm not sure what it's like over in Virginia, but the instance of kids I see out on the street riding their bikes and playing tennis or cricket or soccer out on the street, it's almost once a year or twice a year I see that, whereas growing up I used to see that every day. And it just seems like kids are far more babied and they're constantly on their iPads and tablets indoors and not really getting out there and exploring the world.
And in the long run, it's making us riskier. It's weakening community. It's weakening the ties we have with each other. So there's this recurring paradox in the book that things you do individually to make you feel safe, when everyone does them collectively, they make us all actually less safe.
Yeah, I love that. So on things making us, I suppose, less or more risk averse and more likely not to switch jobs. I mean, I found that an interesting point because in Australia, for example, and in much of the Western world, I think the average tenure for staying at a job has dropped down to something like 3.3 years, which is quite low. I mean, the whole concept of a company man or company woman that stays in one organization for 20 or 30 years simply doesn't exist anymore. So I guess I wanted to clarify what he actually meant there, because it seems to me that people are spending less time in jobs and hop, skip, and jumping from job to job.
Well, I don't know the data for Australia. I do suspect in this regard, Australia is different from the United States. Mm-hmm. But here, time spent in jobs is actually increasing slightly. Right. You've had a mining boom in your West, mm-hmm. and you've restructured your economy to sell all kinds of new things to China and the Pacific Rim.
Correct.
We've been in a more static situation. You haven't had a recession in 25 years, so people feel more free to leave their jobs. They know they can get another one. So in these regards, you're ahead of us and you're more dynamic. But I'm sorry to say we're not matching the performance of our Australian peers in this regard.
Sure. And with the, I suppose, increase in tenure in the United States, is there, I suppose, evidence to suggest that this is particular groups of people within the US, particular types of industries? Like when I think of, say, the West Coast and, the hustle and bustle of Silicon Valley, when I think of New York and places like that, it seems as if the technology boom is really taking hold and people are constantly hop, skip, and jumping. Is this something that's more sort of isolated to, say, the Rust Belt or to more blue-collar types of work?
Well, it's most of the country. I wouldn't say it's true, in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. But it's striking that the Bay Area is a pretty small percentage of the American economy. The one group that is still the most dynamic here, as is the case in many countries, is immigrants. By definition, they've made a big move. They know they'll have to adjust. They don't expect to stick with the first job they get. And I call immigrants our non-complacent class in the United States.
Yeah, and that's a whole other topic, I suppose. There's a lot of thought leadership out there on immigrants, especially when it comes to immigration and entrepreneurship, and coming to the country with very little, but having big dreams, and then not only having dreams, but going after those dreams, taking action, and so on. And your book talks about grand projects and how you believe that Americans are postponing change and they aren't as ambitious as they used to be. So I guess firstly, what's your sort of definition of a grand project?
Winning the Second World War was a grand project. Building the interstate highway system, connecting America or Australia with a network of railways, those were grand projects. We're less interested in those now. The one grand project we've had is to give everyone a smartphone. That's gone pretty well. That's very nice. But in terms of our physical world, we're not, going to the moon as we used to. We don't really have very ambitious plans for our infrastructure. Visions of the American future, they tend to be dystopian in literature and in science fiction. It used to be they were forms of exaggerated progress that reality would then even surpass. But we've lost that notion that our physical environment in the future will somehow be radically different than it is now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure how our audience will feel about that answer. I think definitely at a government-backed, large private enterprise-backed sort of project base, I mean, when you talk about going to the moon, we don't see that anymore. I do see that Moore's Law has dramatically lowered the barriers to entry for anyone wanting to start a technology business. And, we're looking at things like artificial intelligence being integrated into our lives. Solar became cheaper than coal in 2016. The CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technique could totally potentially cure cancer in 10 to 15 years if Bill Gates gets his way. Autonomous vehicles are coming along. We're looking at the 3D printing of human tissues, cells, and even organs. And when it comes to commercial space travel, we've got the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk pushing forward and dramatically lowering the cost of space travel. I think the Falcon rocket that SpaceX has manages to launch and get into orbit for something like 1/25th the price that what it would cost NASA, but NASA's obviously not doing that anymore. And then there's a Khan Academy who democratize education with less than 100 employees. Kids all over the world can get onto that platform. So is it a case of perhaps not so many one or two or three big grand projects, but a lot of, say, smaller projects which collectively can have a big impact on humanity?
We are doing some smaller projects, but keep in mind a lot of what you mentioned is really about the future. So something like driverless cars or CRISPR gene editing techniques, those are coming in terms of the science. We read about them, but they will be delayed for decades because in terms of the law and regulatory frameworks and liability issues, it will take us a very long time to sort those out. Those are technologies, in essence, we are afraid of them. Even though driverless cars are safer than cars driven by human beings, we'll apply much tougher standards to them. You'll need to get the coordination of city governments, county governments, state or provincial governments, the national government. And that's going to be a huge mess. We've become much less able to digest a new physically real technical innovation than we had been in the past.
Yeah, so I guess reading between the lines then, it's not so much that we're not thinking big, but that a lot of the sort of infrastructure or regulatory landscape isn't there. And perhaps that's the issue then.
Or it is there, but it's an obstacle. So we're doing great when it comes to information, like Khan Academy you mentioned. That's a great development. We're going to see more of that. But information is the one sector where we're dynamic, and the rest of the economy, not so much.
Yeah. So what role can, say, governments, both at a federal, state, and local level, do to increase the adoption of, say, CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing techniques, of autonomous vehicles? Obviously, there's other things that slow the adoption. There's human behavior. There's technology infrastructure. Like when you talk about autonomous vehicles, it's not just regulation, but it's also charging stations being readily available. It is people being comfortable stepping into a self-driving car. And the moment someone dies from a self-driving car, which did occur a few months ago. It was all over the news, even though 30,000 people die per year in the US alone on our roads. The moment a machine is behind that death, people just are up in arms about it.
That's correct. So we're applying, tougher standards. If you took today's standards, for safety and predictability, we couldn't have built the modern world had we applied those standards earlier on. And those are the standards we work so hard to implement now.
Mm.
So I think we need, this greater willingness to take risk. What can governments do? They should spend more on research and development. But in most countries in this world, governments are spending either a constant amount or less. More and more of the government budget is taken up by transfers, and our government has become a big insurance company. If you look at what it spends its money on, almost 80% now is spent on insurance of some kind.
Mm. Yeah, and I can't speak too much for the US, but I know the state of Victoria here, the state government, their expenses in the last 10 years alone have doubled. And there's a lot of government-owned bodies whose expenses in the last 5 years alone have doubled, which is a worrying trend because what you're seeing in a lot of private enterprise, particularly these emerging companies, the likes of your SpaceX's and whatnot that I mentioned earlier, is that they're managing to do a lot more with a lot less. The amount of employees they require is significantly less than what they'd required in the past. But in government, we've still got this rhetoric of, oh, if it's a problem and we need to fix it, we'll just throw more resources at it.
That's right. And we're talking right now in our federal government of significantly diminishing the amount of money we give to medical R&D through the National Institutes of Health. That would be a huge mistake. But there's a good chance we'll end up doing it. So we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of government.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on that. And I think rather than... I've had guests on the show previously, such as Parag Khanna, who wrote the book Connectography, who effectively said that government should be engaging more with private enterprise, with academia, rather than trying to do it all itself. Effectively moving to a technocracy rather than your traditional democracy. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm a big fan of his. I very much liked his new book. He and I are doing an event together in Switzerland in a few months' time. And I think he's exactly right. We need to be more technocratic and think of ourselves as building a kind of, mastery over the world.
Yeah.
And not just over information. We're using the transmission of information to slow down changes in our physical world rather than accelerate them.
And then that is effectively what innovation is all about. It's about giving us time.
That's right.
I wanted to touch on your thoughts on Elon Musk. Obviously, a lot of listeners of this show will be a big fan of Musks, but there is a lot more thought leadership and not just thought leadership, but just a lot more articles and sentiment out there that is dividing people. Some say he's a tech visionary, others say he's a financial dilettante. So the recent
both can be true.
Yeah, both of them true, right? I mean, Solar City lost $700 million in the first 9 months of 2016 before merging with Tesla. So, firstly, I mean, where do you stand on this? You just said both of them are true, but where do you lean?
Well, I admire him greatly, but I think he will fail, and his failures will be a sign of the defects of the modern world. The satellite launches, that's succeeding already. I have no worries about that. But Tesla with electric cars seems to be failing financially. The Hyperloop, it's too hard to get the rights to all of the land and all the regulatory clearance. Regulators don't even know what it is they're supposed to be approving. So I think most of his projects will have made this great, grand, glorious effort, but not be able to buck the system. And I think the only one that's really going to last is the satellites.
It's interesting. Do you think there's some benefit, though, in, I suppose, some intangible benefit with having someone like Elon Musk inspire our next generation to adopt that sort of 10x moonshot mindset?
Again, I admire what he's trying to do, but there's also the risk that people see, well, even a guy as spectacular as Elon Musk has failed at this. And whether the next generation will copy him or shy away from that as a role model, I don't think we know yet, but I'm a little worried it might be the latter.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as entrepreneurs and on this podcast in particular, we're always encouraging people to embrace failure to learn. However, we talk about smart failures and failing small so you can recover, as opposed to failing big with multi-million-dollar losses and so on.
Yes, maybe billion-dollar losses in this case.
In this case, billion-dollar losses, that's correct. Okay, so I guess I wanted to just sidestep over to something you've talked about in a blog post I read recently. I believe it was on NPR. We talk about people's complacency, effectively resulting in fiscal deficits, widespread unemployment. And I guess this is an interesting topic, what with the advent of AI and blockchain, potentially creating more wealth than what we know to do with. So there's a lot of talk now about UBI, universal basic income. Will that be the answer? And my thoughts are that even if everybody had access to X amount of dollars, we're still human beings. We still want to contribute. We still want to play a role in the world.
Yes.
Where do you sit on this? I mean, on one hand, yes, we may be looking towards more unemployment, but will it be under the sort of conditions of some sort of a UBI structure?
I used to favor UBI, but I've turned away from the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And what I observe in many countries, the US, especially the United Kingdom, is voters are so unwilling to send money to immigrants. And I think that's unfortunate because immigrants, bring a lot of vitality. But if we put in a UBI, I'm afraid the long run result is we would very drastically restrict immigration and shoot ourselves in the foot. So I don't actually think we can do that. Maybe Denmark could make it work, or New Zealand, but a very large, diverse country. I now think UBI is unfortunately not the path forward.
So have you done much pondering about the path forward when it comes to, say, artificial intelligence, automation, potentially replacing most of today's jobs? And there's no crystal clear evidence to suggest that those jobs will be replaced. In the past, whenever there was a big type of technology disruption, there may have been a paradox, and then new jobs were created, and we all moved on. However, the trend seems to be labor market productivity is decreasing. The amount of employees that organizations are employing is decreasing. What are your thoughts on the evolution of AI and what it means for employment?
My previous book called The Average is Over is on exactly that question. I think we'll see a lot of jobs disappear at a much higher rate because of AI. There will be new jobs created, but a lot of them will have lower pay, and they'll mostly be service sector jobs. So people who are good at service sector jobs will do okay. I think this will favor women over men for the most part. Manufacturing jobs will become harder and harder to get. This will remove more and more workers from the ultimate source of innovation. Mm-hmm. So I think it will be a very rocky transition period for most countries.
And I like the title of your previous book, Average is Over. It actually reminds me of the conversation I had with Alec Ross, where he basically said there will be no room for mediocrity. We were talking about legal technology and how it will automate a lot of what associates and even senior associates do. And that rather than 5 associates reviewing a contract, you'll probably have one who's really good reviewing the output of, say, 5 or 10 automated contract reviews, as opposed to having 5 people review those contracts. So he basically said, similar to what your book proposes, average is over, and unless you're absolutely excellent at something, there will be no place for you.
Yes, but the people who are highly productive will earn much, much more, and we've seen this trend already, of course.
And that trend that we were talking about at the start of the show about the divides just seems like it's set to get bigger and bigger based on that, unless there are some sort of fundamental changes. So one final point, or one of the final points I wanted to touch on was the median male wage was actually in the United States was actually higher in 1969 than today. Can you elaborate on that?
It's just now reached parity. When I wrote that sentence, it was true, but now we're back to where we were.
Wow.
That's the so-called good news.
But that is quite fascinating. I mean, for half a century, when you think about inflation and the impact of the cost of just buying a home, to have the median male wage remain stagnant. I mean, is that adjusted for inflation, or?
That's adjusted for inflation. It's also a sign that a lot of the progress we've made has been the result of women working more and being better educated, which is great, great for everyone. But, that's an advance in productivity. It's not going to happen a second time. The number of women working is not going to go up again an amount equivalent to what it did the first time because of women's liberation. So a lot of the men have been getting a kind of free ride due to women working harder.
And I guess, yeah. And I guess there are a lot of other influencing factors. And I mean, we often draw similarities, or not similarities, you often compare where we are today with, say, where we were in the 50s and 60s in terms of productivity growth. But I guess we had the very unique circumstances then of being in a post-World War II boom where we were effectively working off a low base, whereas now we're at a much higher base.
Yes, exactly.
And the last thing I wanted to touch on before we jump into our lightning round, Tyler, was you've got a quiz on your website where people can actually test how complacent they are. What can you tell us about that?
Well, if you read my book, The Complacent Class, and you wonder, how do I fit into this picture? This is something a few of us came up with to try to look at your own life and see, how many chances are you taking? And, I would just stress as an author, to write a book is a response to a problem. It's actually a somewhat complacent form of a response. I could have gone out there and thrown a brick, and I didn't. So we all have a fair amount of complacency within ourselves, and I will plead guilty to that as well.
But I guess what you are effectively doing is raising awareness, and the more people that
That's
are
correct.
aware, the higher the likelihood that someone will go out there and throw a brick.
I don't favor the brick throwing, but I think we here in the U.S., we need a much greater sense of urgency. And again, our U.S. and Australia are a bit different in this regard. We have more problems than you do right now.
It's very interesting. Okay, Tyler, well, look, thank you so much. You've provided our audience with a lot of knowledge and a lot to ponder, and we'll link up the book in the show notes. But before I let you go, I cannot let you go without throwing you into our lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
I'm ready.
This. Okay, so question number one is, if you could work for any company at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be and why?
If I had the technical ability, I would have loved to have worked for Google in the early years when they were developing search and changing the world in a way no one thought was possible.
Yeah.
That would be my pick.
Definitely, and back when they were competing with the likes of, who was it? Alta Vista and Lycos and AOL at the time.
Yes, I think also University of Chicago earlier in the 20th century was very impressive, involved in the atom bomb, a lot of economists, famous political thinkers. That was a very magical time there. That would be another pick.
Great answer. And question number two, Tyler, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I suppose I would ask Jesus Christ, well, what really happened?
That's a great one. I've had people in the past say they would just look into the eyes of someone like Jesus Christ just to get the measure of the man, which was an interesting one. But that's a great answer. And finally, I like to get into the minds of high performers and find out how they stay on top of their games. But you're now 56, Tyler, and you're still releasing books, still raising awareness around the world of these very important topics. How do you stay on top of your game? Do you have any rituals or routines?
Curiosity, but I would say the most important thing you need to do, get it done first thing in the morning, every day, no matter what. Do it every day. It will add up, and you'll get better and more productive at it every single day. Get it done first. Focus on it. That's my advice.
Fantastic. Love it. Okay, so where can people go to find out a little bit more about you, Tyler, and connect?
Well, they can Google my name, Tyler Cowen, Cowen. My Twitter handle is @TylerCowen. I have a homepage. I write a blog called Marginal Revolution. You can Google to that. And I have an online education site called mruniversity.com with free videos about economics.
Fantastic. We'll link that up in the show notes for all of our listeners. Thanks again, Tyler. You've been an awesome guest, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure. Take care.
Cheers.
Have a good day. Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what was both a challenging and thought-provoking conversation on the impact that technology can have on humanity. Before you go, the Innovation Manager's Handbook Volume 2 comes out this Tuesday on Amazon, this Tuesday, March the 28th, and you can pick up a digital copy for the price of just a coffee. So head over to theinnovationmanagershandbook.com to get your free bonus bundle, which includes a digital copy of version 1 of the book, a free 1-hour Q&A webinar with me, and an innovation health check tool, which you can use to determine just how innovative your organization really is. So that's the innovationmanagershandbook.com. Until next time, Future Squared is out.